we will try and kick off quickly because what is important after the three presentations we're having this morning is the opportunity for you to discuss some of the issues raised. And in order to do that, we are going to, Claire at the back is going to quickly put up a reminder of how the Slido system works. So firstly, down in the bottom left, DC conference, is everyone got the broadband Wi-Fi password already? There we are, DC conference, February 2019. Sorry, Claire. And then let's just, to refresh your mind of how you get onto the Slido. It's pretty straightforward. Have a look there. getupslido.com. Biod conference, so BiodConf, Con 19. And we are in the George's Hall at the bottom there, George's Hall. And so throughout the talks, you can put in questions. You can also vote up questions so that at the end, we will have a nice summary of some of the questions from the floor. What I will also do at the end of our session, end of a little bit of discussion, is put the idea to all of you of what kind of a conclusion one might make from the three talks we've heard. What are the important things that might be significant to furthering the interests of biodiversity in this island? And in doing so, I think a powerful message is always that a conference actually delivers a written statement of what the attendees, the speakers, would really like to see happen in the world. For our three speakers this morning, we have a nice mixture of looking at high-end computing, how we can understand and model climates, but also we are looking at how some of our most sensitive habitats may be impacted by changes in the climate, and also looking at species themselves, the long-term monitoring, what that has revealed. And in the last week, there's been a number of stories, both internationally and here in Ireland, of information about the decline of invertebrates, but with very specific numbers attached to them. So I want to also point out that our speakers are going to be in a slightly different sequence than is shown on the board there. Our first speaker is going to be Paul Nolan from the Irish Centre for High-End Computing. Our second speaker is going to be John Coll, who is talking about the Irish Climate Analysis and Research Unit. And Tomas Murray will be our third speaker, talking about information that the National Biodiversity Data Centre has been gathering. When we come to questions from the floor, we do have two microphones. Please be aware that this conference is being streamed live on the internet, so do not start asking your question until you have the microphone in your hand, please. It just ensures that viewers and listeners from around the world will be able to hear your question. So our first speaker, Paul Nolan. Paul works at the Irish Centre for High-End Computing, which is a national body under the aegis of the National University of Ireland in Galway. Their purpose is to develop data management techniques for the economic and societal benefits to academia, industry, and the public sector. So Paul manages a range of projects there in the areas of modelling the present and future climate of Ireland. And he works on that at a range of scales, from global projects feeding into the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to highly detailed regional projections for Ireland. So Paul, can I invite you up?
So thank you, Matthew. Right, so as Matthew mentioned, I work at the Irish Centre for High-End Computing. I also work closely with Éireann. I'm actually based there a few days per week. I'm funded by the Department of Climate Communications, Climate Action and Environment and EPA. I'll also be partly funded by the Marine Institute starting in April. So I'm going to give a brief overview of global climate projections, so how we model the global climate, and then I'm going to talk about regional climate projections for Ireland. So one way to assess how changing greenhouse gases and land use affect our future climate is to use global climate models, and these are more commonly being referred to as Earth system models. So one such model is the ICHEC model. It's a model developed by a consortium of 29 European partners. It's one of well over 30 IPCC class climate models. So on the right here you can see the different institutes throughout Europe who work on developing the model. ICHEC and Éireann were partnered on developing and running the climate simulations of ICHEC. So here's an overview of ICHEC. This is why the models, GCMs, are more commonly referred to as Earth system models. Previously, a global climate model would just comprise of an atmospheric model, maybe coupled with an ocean model. But more recently, these Earth system models are becoming more complicated. So we can see they comprise of different Earth system components, such as atmospheric chemistry, sea ice, greenhouse, Greenland ice sheet, and so on. And they're all coupled together using a coupler. So all these models run and then communicate with one another through a coupler. So, oops, all right. So, results of our ICHEC simulations, we've contributed towards the coupled model intercomparison project, CMIT 5, and the IPCC AR5 reports. So we're currently running the updated CMIT 6 simulations, and these simulations will be comprise of Ireland's contributions to the IPCC AR6 reports. So actually these simulations started this week, these CMIT 6 simulations. So here's, this visualization shows annual temperature change as simulated by the ICHEC model. So the simulations run from 1900 until the end of the century. Blue colours show a year that's colder than usual, and orange or red colours show a year that's warmer than usual. And you can see the range goes from -8 to +8. The top left panel shows a more optimistic future scenario. So it's the RPC 4.5. So society will make some effort to curb greenhouse gases by introducing green technologies and so on. The top right is what's known as a business as usual. Sorry?
Just make sure you speak to those
yeah,
at
okay.
all times, just so the streaming works.
Okay, no problem.
Okay.
Yeah. So the top right shows a more pessimistic scenario. So you can see that we see large projected changes, particularly for the more pessimistic scenario. The bottom panel shows the annual temperature change averaged over the whole planet. So you can see a steady increase in temperature from 1900 to the end of the century. And the two RCPs, the two future scenarios, don't diverge until after 2050. The blue line shows the observed temperature change. So you can see we have good match between the observed temperature rise and modeled temperature rise. And it's kind of difficult to see, but you might note that the red lines comprise of different smaller red lines. So these are different climate simulation ensembles. And the fact that they're in close agreement, there's not much spread, adds confidence to these temperature changes. So here we have a similar visualization that shows annual percentage change in rainfall. And I just showed this figure just to demonstrate how rainfall is more, projections of rainfall is more uncertain. So you can see on the bottom panel, there's a larger spread between the different ensemble members. But even though there's a larger spread between the different ensemble members, you can see that there's a general upward trend in temperature on a global scale. And again, this figure demonstrates the utility of running different ensemble members. If we were to just run one, we could have been unlucky and picked the one that shows little to no increase in rainfall by the end of the century. On the other hand, we might have picked a more extreme one. So it's best to run an ensemble, and then we can get a handle on the uncertainty of the different climate change in rainfall. So these models are quite useful for assessing climate change on a large scale, but they're extremely computationally expensive to run. So we're limited to running these models on a low spatial resolution. So the last round of IPCC models had a standard resolution of 125 kilometre, which is not great for assessing climate change on the scale the size of Ireland. So it's not possible to assess the impact of climate change at a regional scale using these models. So one way to get around this is to use regional climate models. So we take the global data set, so it's the global data set on a low spatial resolution, and we downscale over Ireland, or a smaller area, and because we run over a smaller area, we can afford to go to much higher spatial resolution. So we use regional climate models to do this, and a regional climate model is just like a weather forecast model, except instead of running it for a week, we run it for 100 years, say. And we don't actually go directly from global down to high resolution regional. We do use these intermediate steps or nests. So we actually go from the top left here shows the surface topography as simulated by the ECR model. So you can see we don't get, we have 2 or 3 grid points over Ireland. We have a little mountain range over the Midlands. If we go to 50, we get much better, things start to improve, and then we get further improvements from 18 to 4. So obviously any climate field that is directly correlated to the local topography will be much better simulated by high resolution models. So for example, rainfall. Here's rainfall. So before we run the models into the future, we run them into the past to ensure that the models are able to accurately simulate the climate of Ireland. So here we have observed winter rainfall for this 34-year period, 1982 to 2014. And on the right, we have rainfall as simulated by one of the regional climate models at 18 kilometre spatial resolution. You can see the model is able to pick up the general features. It's not bad. We have high rainfall in the west and drier regions in the east. But when we go to 6 kilometre, you can see things vastly improve. And then when we go to 2 kilometre, we get much better improvements. Actually, I showed 2 here, but in the end, we decided to run our simulations at 4 kilometre spatial resolution. There's always a trade-off between running at very high resolution, that's very accurate, but then we can't run a large ensemble. So we kind of had a trade-off. We'd run at 4 kilometre and run a relatively large ensemble. And I just show rainfall here. Rainfall is one of the more difficult fields for a model to simulate, but of course we validated all the different climate fields such as temperature and wind speed and so on. So now that we know that the RCMs, the regional climate models, are able to accurately simulate the past climate, we run the models into the future. And the only difference is increases in greenhouse gases. So we simulated the future climate at high spatial resolution, 4 kilometre, for this 40-year period, 2021 to 2060. And more recently, we've extended this period to the end of the century. And then to have something to compare against, we run the models into the past, and then difference between the future and the past provide a measure of climate change. So as I mentioned previously, individual climate projections are subject to uncertainty. So we can't just run one and then base national policy on one projection. We could be wrong. So we run a large ensemble. So through the ensemble approach, we can assign confidence to projections. So just say if all the ensemble members agree on a particular projection, say temperature, we have high confidence. If there's a large spread or disagreement between the individual simulations, we have low confidence in that particular projection. And here's just one more figure just to demonstrate the utility of the ensemble method. So just imagine we have 12 different simulations, each showing slightly different temperature projections, ranging from low to high. Here we have 12, but in reality, it will be much larger. It will be about 50. So the ensemble method allows us to pick a conservative temperature projection. So this 90 percentile, or very likely projection, it's a projection such that 90% of the simulations predict that temperature or higher. So another common percentile is the likely. This is a projection such that 66% of the projections project a temperature of this or higher. So this allows us to assign confidence. We can be somewhat sure projections will be at least these temperatures in the future. Also, as well, this method allows policymakers to make decisions on the more extreme projections. They might decide, even though it's a low probability, the impact might be worth applying policy measures. So just to summarise, we take the global climate model data and we downscale over Ireland at high spatial resolution. To create a large ensemble, we used a whole host of different international global models, and we used a number of regional climate models to downscale over Ireland. So this builds up a large ensemble of high resolution climate projections for Ireland. To get a handle on the uncertainty in the future climate emission scenarios, we simulated the future climate using a range of the IPCC scenarios for the future, ranging from low to high. So we used the older AR4, B1, A1B, and then all of the newer RCPs. We've since archived these older B1, A1B, A2s. So running such a large ensemble was a very high computationally intensive project, and it required 3 to 4 years running on supercomputers. And then in the next few figures, I'm just going to show some regional climate projections for Ireland, and to simplify matters, on the left will be a more optimistic scenario, and on the right will be projections for a more pessimistic or high emission scenario. So first up are regional projections for regional temperature projections for mid-century. So we see that temperature is expected to rise by between 1 and 1.6 degrees by mid-century, depending on scenario. And we see that there's a clear west to east gradient in the temperature change. Keep in mind, this is a mean of a large ensemble, but still the regional detail still is clear. We found that changes in temperatures were enhanced for the extremes. So we found that summer daytime temperatures are projected to rise even further than mean temperatures. So between 0.7 and 2.5 degrees by mid-century. Obviously, this projected increase in summer daytime temperatures will have an effect on the number of heat waves in the future. So we can see heat waves are projected to increase over the whole country with a northwest to southeast gradient by mid-century. Similar to summer daytime temperatures, we found that winter nighttime temperatures are projected to rise by a larger amount compared to the mean, so between 1 and 3 degrees by mid-century. So this will have a direct effect on the number of frost days by mid-century. So we can see by mid-century, frost days are projected to decrease by between 30 and 60% by mid-century. A frost day is defined as the day when the minimum 2-meter temperature is less than 0 degrees. So we found that because of the temperature rises, the growing season is projected to rise. So this might have some positive but also negative effects. Maybe farmers might have the opportunity to introduce new crops. But a larger growing season means that maybe plants might start to grow earlier, but then might get destroyed by frost. For rainfall, we found that over the whole year, rainfall shows small projected decreases, but they're quite small. But we did find that the variability of rainfall is projected to change. So summers are projected to get drier, so we're going to have more dry events. And we also found that winters are projected to get more wetter. So again, even though rainfall shows small projected changes, the variability of the rainfall climate is projected to change. We'll have both more dry events and more wet events. So because of the extreme run of storms we had over a recent number of winters, we looked at future projections of extreme storm tracks. So what we found was that overall, actually, the number of storms is projected to decrease, but we did find that the number of intense storms is projected to increase slightly over Ireland. Although I'll be the first to admit here that more work needs to be done here because by their very nature, these are rare events. So you need a very large ensemble of climate projections to get a robust handle on the results here. So here's just a summary of the key findings. So mean temperatures are projected to increase by between 1 and 1.5 degrees by mid-century. Summer daytime temperatures are expected to increase by over 2 degrees. Frost nights are projected to decrease by about 50% by mid-century. The growing season is up. We've found that summer is projected to get drier and winter is projected to get wetter, winter and autumn actually. I didn't show these results, but there's a general decrease in the wind energy resource, except winter where the results are more uncertain. So the work, an overview of the work is provided in this EPA 2015 report. This report is getting a bit old now, so we're currently working on updating this report. So we're using more up-to-date global models and climate models. We've extended the period it's a continuous period, 1975 to 2100, and the future climate will be simulated using all 4 RCPs. There are emission scenarios. So here's just a taste of some preliminary end of temperature projections. So each column shows the different RCPs. So the first column is a low optimistic RCP, and then the last column, the fourth column, is a pessimistic, and then the rows show the different 30-year periods. So for the more, you can see for the more pessimistic scenario, temperatures are projected to rise by 3 degrees by the end of the century, which is a very large amount. And finally, here's some preliminary end-of-century rainfall projections for winter. So you can see all models show an increase in rainfall, actually for all RCPs and for all time periods. And you can see a bit, these results are somewhat exciting because for the first time we can see regional detail in the rainfall projections. There's a northwest to southeast gradient. So, thank you.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. One of the points that Paul would like to make is that, yes, a lot of this is based upon physical parameters, but the whole point of the high-end computing team he leads is the more biological data that he can collaborate with people at putting into these models, the more accurate some of the information will become. So I hope that'll be something that we can discuss later on. Our second speaker, Dr. John Coll from the Irish Climate Analysis and Research Unit, which is based in the Department of Geography at Maynooth University. Their role there is providing data and advice to the scientific community, policymakers, and again, for the benefit of society. John's work concerns the application of climate change modelling to assess the impacts that climate change is likely to have on natural systems. In particular, the likely predicted changes to some of our more threatened habitats. He's presenting here today a collaborative project that's been looking at some of these vegetation types and the likely impacts that changing climate will bring. So, John.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. So, yes, I'm here really to talk about the impacts on some of Ireland's, what we think are vulnerable natural resources. So the emphasis of the work that I've led historically at ICHEC and Maynooth has looked at habitats, but obviously have to thank some colleagues that I worked collaboratively with really from 2008 until 2012 when we had core funding for this work. So David Burke's now at Liverpool John Moores University. Micheline has retired, but she was famously here last year recreating Breaking a Window at Dublin Castle, honouring her grandmother's act of suffrage. St Michael Gormley and my old boss at ICHEC at Maynooth, John Sweeney. So the emphasis of the original work I'll present today is how we modelled the habitats, but obviously if we're projecting changes in the climate space associated with habitats, then we can expect impacts for some of the species that we know are already struggling, such as the curlew and perhaps in places the red grouse. And just figure out the IT.
Let me just check it's still on. It is. Yeah, just a real hard push.
Okay. Okay, so what I'd like to do then is just, if the IT behaves, what I'd like to do is look at some sort of other issues. So obviously climate change, as we know, when we look at biodiversity, isn't the only game in town. So one paradigm I use for trying to get the bigger message across to our students at Maynooth, for example, is to use the Anthropocene as kind of a paradigm of how we think about climate change and this bigger suite of drivers, the whole suite of drivers that are driving the changes that we see for our biodiversity and our natural resources. So in Stefan et al., for example, they would refer to that as a great acceleration. So in their view, climate change is just one of this suite of whole-scale changes where we're turning the Earth into a laboratory that's not really working too well for natural resources and species globally. So just to summarise the issues then, and again, this is kind of big system science, if you like, where Rockstrom et al. Initially at the Stockholm Environment Institute did a sort of metadata analysis, a meta-evidence analysis, and come up with the big issues that they thought were driving the suite of changes that we see globally. So obviously biodiversity loss was right up there, alongside changes to the climate, as well as changes in chemical cycle. So of course today, what we want to focus on in this session then is just looking at what climate change means for species globally, but I want to quickly kind of focus into what it could mean for where we think the vulnerabilities are, both for our habitats and our species in Ireland. So if anybody's interested in more information on these concepts, the link's there on the slide if you want to look into this some more. And again, Matthew asked us to assume that there might not be wide knowledge in the room, so I just wanted to say a little bit about habitat fragmentation. Of course, when we think of our situation in Ireland, we're very much in a historically modified cultural landscape. So climate change isn't going to play out against the backdrop of some sort of pristine resource. And we know from even the opening plenary that a lot of our habitats are not in good shape. And the concern is, of course, that the changes in climate coming along to impact already degraded habitats could have severe consequences for later in the century in terms of what we would like to conserve for the future. So I just took a generic slide here showing the process of fragmentation and how it can impact upon species. But it's also important for thinking holistically for Ireland, what it means in terms of taking a whole landscape approach to how we might adapt our landscape, how we might adapt our protected areas in the face of a changing climate. So climate's going to play out then against this fragmented landscape already. We're going to have less resilient systems due to the historical degradation. And if we're thinking holistically in terms of how we plan, how we think about adaptation for the future, we need to try and integrate landscape approaches. So just an example, just again, a generic slide, just looking at fragmentation and loss example for Ireland, looking at active blanket bog, I've done a lot of work on. It's a suite of pressures, for example. I don't know if Katrina Douglas is in the room, but I know Katrina doesn't appreciate afforestation of our upland bogs, for instance. New development pressures, perhaps, for some of the upland bogs, maybe the wind farm developments. So just to make the point then that for large swathes in the Midlands, where previously we had a lot of the habitat types, the Annex 1 habitats that we're interested in are now very much an agricultural landscape. And the point I'd like to make then is we have to look at both structural and functional connectivity of the landscape when we're thinking about future adaptation for nature with climate change. And the last slide I'd like to come to is when we really think about this idea of engineering the landscape, we should really think in 3 dimensions in terms of how we might manage upland areas to kind of promote refugia, perhaps for species or habitats that might not persist where they are at the present elevation. I'll say more about that in some of the later slides. So it's this whole idea then that we have to think about how do we provide these corridors, stepping stones and buffers for species to move through the landscape as we think climate will drive them north, further north and perhaps upslope. So we have to look at restoration, we have to look at monitoring and put all this really into quite a busy planning matrix when we think about what climate change could mean for Ireland's habitats. So just a little flavour then of some of the original work that we produced for Ireland. Kind of early in the work, I focused on some of the priority bog habitats. It was partly pragmatic because as we developed the methods earlier on, we found that we could model some of these habitats reasonably successfully, so we could reproduce the distribution in the present from the impact models that we developed with the preliminary methods that we were using. So there's an EPA report published in 2013, Coordination, Communication of Adaptation for Climate Change. As part of that, we looked at the implications for species and habitats. So just a flavour of some of the results from that work then. So the framework we were working in here, we were using artificial neural networks. So to give an idea of the impacts modelling, basically you just join up the climate data for Ireland with the biological data. So you have a binary surface of ones and zeros, and we just run ensembles of models or specific model types on that binary surface to model the probability of a future event. So what we did here then in artificial neural networks framework is we took some of the priority habitats and we looked at those under assumptions of limited dispersal, i.e. habitats not being adjacent to each other in the present, and based on an unlimited dispersal. And hopefully, as you can see from the slide here, for the bulk of the priority habitats, the ANDS-based models were projecting substantial losses of climate space compared to the baseline present we were using, which was 1961 to 1990. If we take that down to species, then I'll come back to say some more about the habitats associated with the species. So looking at a range of active blanket bog species, including a lot of the sphagnum, some of the lichens. Again, whichever dispersal scenario we looked at, for a lot of the species, based in this modelling framework, the news was not good, basically. So turning to the habitats, so this is, I'll explain briefly just what's different about the methods here. We were out of core funding on the work by this time, but fortunately the authorship team, including myself, tried to keep the work and the methods going around other work that we were doing at the time. So what we did here then is we arrived at a more sophisticated impact modelling framework. So we used something called Biomod, which actually gives you an ensemble of up to 9 statistical predictive models that you implement in the R computing environment. So what we did then is we took one criticism, I've criticised it myself in the 2014 paper on the bogs. We only had access to one set of future projections for 2031 to 2060, based in one old A1B scenario. There's obviously synergies going forward with the sorts of stuff that Paul presented to revisit aspects of this work using some of the new climate projections. But in the detail of our impacts modelling then, this ensemble approach of the model reduces some of the uncertainty from the different families of the impact model. So not to get hung up in the technicalities of it, when we looked at the Annex 1 data, so this is basically National Parks and Wildlife Service data, joined up with the Joint Nature Conservancy Council data for Northern Ireland, so we could model on an all-island basis. As we can see, the impact models for that scenario and for that climate model are projecting wholesale losses of climate space in red in the southwest associated with the blanket bog distribution. An interesting feature of our work, if you read the wider literature on species distribution modelling and implications of climate change for biodiversity, you'll see a lot of reference to uplands serving as refugia. So the idea is that mountains, being cooler than the surrounding lowlands, might serve as a future refugia for species that we think are vulnerable, that might be impacted. So I put up figure 5 from the 2014 Boggs paper, simply to show that the stable areas, and we can see it on the map in places, a lot of the stable areas of climate space were associated with uplands. So it's the first kind of modelling exercise with this ensemble of models at a 10-kilometre resolution. Another novel aspect of our modelling is we introduced terrain variables, so we had terrain covariates in there, including elevation range and mean elevation. So a lot of the stable areas for the blanket bog, there's a pattern of preservation of suitable upland climate space superimposed in this gradient of loss, southwest to northeast across Ireland. Moving on, so what we did then in 2016, or prior to that obviously for doing the work, we decided that we'd apply the same frameworks, again just some ensemble modelling in the biomod modelling framework. Again, just working in one future projection, one future scenario. We thought we would look at the changes in analogous Annex 1 habitats and wet heaths in the first instance, and also to look at what the changes might mean for some of the upland and alpine heath. So again, we could see changes largely similar with some of what we got for the bogs. So again, this pattern of greater loss of suitable climate space for the wet heath in the southwest and the south of Ireland. We get somewhat more surprising results for alpine and upland heath because the consensus in the available literature was that upland and alpine heath was actually more vulnerable than the wet heath. Based on our modelling framework here, we were showing more overall potential loss of climate space for the wet heath from the ensemble of models compared to the upland heath that people had thought was potentially more vulnerable. And again, coming back to some of Paul's dialogue, if we ran different climate projections, we might get entirely different results from some of these impact models in the ensemble. So really, again, to make the point, some of this work could be doing with being revisited with new data. So what could it mean then? What I've done here is I've just taken the bogs ensemble map from the 2014 paper and the wet heaths ensemble projection map from the 2016 paper. I came to Maynooth in 2008, so early on in my career in Ireland, we did some work for Coll Sustainable Development Council. We were just basically asked to scope at quite high level, and again, Deirdre, I don't know if Deirdre's here, but NPWS were very supportive to scope what biodiversity, or what climate change meant for biodiversity in Ireland. So as part of that work, I joined up just the spatial data of the protected areas. So if we look at the projections, for example, from the ensemble models on the habitats, we can see that where the models are projecting that we'll lose suitable climate space for the habitats are, in a lot of cases, coincident with our protected areas. And of course, this comes back to what I was saying in the earlier slides about this idea of looking at the landscape as a matrix and having to think about adaptive planning at a landscape scale. So if we can bring together results like this, then we can start to hopefully inform options for adaptation. So it wouldn't take much further work, for example, to go and take the impact model results, join those up to the spatial data and see what the numbers in terms of kilometres or hectares of loss would mean for protected areas. Of course, this requires funding. So adaptation strategies then, I've just taken a sort of generic view from ecosystem science more generally here. So we should really try and ensure our options are the do no harm variety, so we could really revisit the old 1990s precautionary principle idea. I've already mentioned we could easily improve the scenarios of future climate change, so we could run more global, downscaled global climate model projections through the impact models. We could create more ensembles of the impact models based in different scenarios to better inform what we think the detail of the projected changes mean for the habitats and the species in our landscapes. We obviously need to develop national adaptation plans. We need to complete an assessment of adaptive capacity and undertake a full vulnerability assessment. There's this idea then that we might actually have to, based on these actions then, triage our natural resources and decide what's priorities, what we can do something about and what we can't. So we have to go through the preceding actions to come up with the priority list that we think is important. Crucially, again, coming back to some of the opening things at the plenary, and again, when I did the initial core work, most people haven't heard of the term of biodiversity. It's crucial that we engage people in planning and what climate change could mean for their landscapes, their country locally. Based in more biology, we maybe have to look at the whole design of our reserves and try and think about how we maybe redesign the protected area network to protect certain species at critical life stages, and I'm sure Tomas will say much more about that in the next session. And of course, we have to try and respond to changes already inherent in the system. Arising from that, then, there are questions of monitoring. Are our monitoring networks adequate? Are our monitoring networks adequately funded? If we have effective monitoring networks, we can join up our modelling efforts with the monitoring. Do the models predict what the monitoring tells us? If we don't have the fundamental data from the monitoring, then we're modelling in the dark in a lot of instances. So it's really important that we join up our thinking. Some conclusions then. So obviously biodiversity, climate change isn't the only pressure that we're worried about, it's just the whole sum of us as a hugely successful apex predator, conducting a large-scale experiment in our own country here in Ireland and globally. So in the present, we know that habitat loss presents the single greatest threat to global biodiversity, and it's also the case for many regions. In the future, we need more work to be done, more primary research, more modelling based on hopefully improved monitoring for our habitats, our species in Ireland. So wider thinking then is that as things warm up, the temperatures change, species will try and migrate towards higher latitudes or to higher elevations. So this comes back to this idea of adapting the landscape, engineering the landscape, if you like, to facilitate species on the move. But we've got a slight problem in Ireland and for maritime uplands more generally, basically because our mountains, by comparison with somewhere like the Alps, are much lower in elevation. There's much less climate space, potentially, for species to move into. So a lot of my early work, I've been pretty interested in hills and mountains really since I was a young teenager. So much of my PhD work was looking at what climate change could mean for upland regions. So this whole idea then, if we're thinking about going back to this idea of engineering the landscape, if we're thinking in a vertical dimension and based on some of those results, for example, from the bog impact models, if we think our uplands may serve as a refuge area, we should maybe integrate the vertical component, if you like, into our adaptation thinking. And I quite like this slide from Trends in Ecology and Evolution paper in 2009. Josette Puenuelas calls this the elevator to extinctions. It's just this idea that as the climate warms, even for mountain regions and their valuable endemics, then they might actually just be spaced above the summits, and pretty much my PhD work looked at aspects of that and what it could mean for uplands in Scotland, for example. So I think we'll have general questions at the end. So there's a lot of people we have to thank that helped develop the capacity for Ireland. So I see Matthew's trying to give me a hint here to finish, so I'll just leave the thanks to the people that helped us up on the board, and obviously the funders is the EPA.
John, thank you. John, thank you for that. Very sobering facts that you've uncovered. And again, John was pointing out the importance of positive stories. At the end of that, there are solutions to these. And the repetition of this, it is vital that we change public opinion, because that is what leads to voter choice, that leads to political change. Have a look at the Slido thing. There are 12 questions there already. It's an opportunity to make sure that we vote up the most significant questions at the end, because our time will be limited. Our third speaker, Tomas Murray, is an ecologist working at the National Biodiversity Data Centre down in New Ross. Tomas has been coordinating the National Citizen Science Monitoring Schemes for a number of years, looking at insects, and he has also been developing national biodiversity indicators. He has 15 years of research experience on insects, investigating their ecology, diseases, and genetic impacts with regard to their survival. Tomas has been responsible for the data centre's recent work on butterfly and bumblebee monitoring schemes, and that got some excellent press coverage this last week. So Tomas, please come and tell us more.
So I can still say good morning for another few minutes. So hello everybody. Today my role really is just to communicate sort of the very broadest impact of climate change on our flora, on our fauna, on our terrestrial systems and our aquatic systems. Like that, going through everything from sort of genes to individuals to populations to communities, but also biological processes, particular things that ultimately allow our wildlife to exist within Ireland. We'll also then examine what John already touched on, is the role of climate as a driver in biodiversity loss and species extinction, and its relative importance. And then ultimately end on, okay, what is the evidence base for Ireland? Where are our essential biodiversity indicators for climate change in Ireland? So like that, climate change ultimately is an enormous driver of natural selection. And so we can think of this new frightening climate regime that we're now entering as a filter. And it's only those species and only those systems that ultimately can adapt or, by happenstance, thrive in that new regime. So it's very much a filter. And as this excellent review by Brett Schaefer's, who led this global synthesis on the evidence base of climate change and its impact on biodiversity, it's complicated. So what's best is to break it down a little bit. So I love this next particular infographic. So what this is showing is ultimately, the outer red circle there is 100% of all the studies they examined found an impact of climate change, and the center would be absolutely zero. So when they started looking at different systems, so when I'm talking about systems here, I'm talking about the marine, freshwater, and terrestrial systems. You can immediately see, okay, the laser is very faint, but at the bottom of that circle, you can see the different ecosystems. And broadly, look, at climate change is now impacting all systems, full stop. And the evidence there is quite strong. When we start looking at its impact across the range of biological organization, so again, looking at the individual organism scale in the top left there, again, not so much evidence there. Again, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but the level of research at the individual level is still quite limited, or the evidence base. As soon as we go down to the bottom left, when we start looking at populations of individuals, then we have much stronger evidence base for the impact of climate change at the population level. Up to the top right again, at the species level, absolutely. As soon as we start studying our biodiversity at the species level, and particularly where species currently are and where they're moving to, 100%. This is where we have an incredibly clear signal of climate change driving changes in biodiversity. And then at the community level, so a whole mix of these particular species and how that mix is now changing. Again, incredibly strong evidence for how climate change is impacting communities of different species. So just to give some very quick examples. So on the left, we have this lovely little crustacean. It's all over the northern hemisphere and in our waters in Ireland, called Daphnia magna. So Daphnia magna, this little water flea, They looked at the bottom graph there, the bottom bar chart. They looked at soils or clay soils that were collected in rivers in 1955 and 1965, between the 1950s and 60s. And they reared eggs from those 1950s and 60s clays and compared them to contemporary populations in exactly the same population. And they found that at a population level, genetically had it changed to now become adapted to a 4-degree increase in baseline temperature. So modern populations are now more tolerant to a 4 degrees warmer freshwater in these systems. The top bar chart there is where they actually replicated the whole experiment, but ultimately over a 2-year process, selectively breeding those little water fleas to be able to exist in that 4-degree new world. So again, it was just a really nice example of how genetically climate change has actually changed species. On the right-hand side, again, would be the more classic example at the population level, looking at the change of phenology. So here, again, it's downy birch, and this data is coming from Ireland. It's coming from our network of Irish phenological gardens, whereby we could see by mid-century, that green map of Ireland at the bottom, an advancement of between 3 to 5 days in bud burst in these particular clones of downy birch across the gardens. And then by the end of century, compared to baseline, an increase of maybe up to 8 to 10 days advancement in bud burst in this particular species. Again, at the community level, I had to get data from Germany. I could have chosen data from many other countries, but I couldn't get data from Ireland. So when we start looking at the community level and the mix of species that we have, in this particular study, across 22 different long-term data sets, across a whole variety of different flora and fauna, both terrestrial and aquatic, wherever you see a little red dot, that's where the species has shifted since 1980. So not 1960, not 1900s, since 1980, where that whole community is now shifted to having more species who prefer warmer climates. Again, the signal is very clear with many of the different terrestrial groups, and it's a whole variety. It's flora, it's invertebrates, it's mammals. And the shift itself wasn't so consistent as soon as we started looking at freshwater and marine communities. So there's challenges there in trying to get a very clear evidence base at a community level and the system or group that you use to look at it. On the right-hand side, going at the very broadest level, again, peatlands would have been the classic example, but it's been excellently covered by John in his own work. So here we're looking at, again, sea level change, unfortunately. And current projections for Ireland by end of century will be in the order of 55 to 60 centimetres around the coast increase. And again, all the consequent impacts that will have in terms of salt inundation in our wetlands, in terms of physical damage to our coastal systems, and ultimately, again, the impact that may have on our floodplains and our groundwater. So that's looking at the sort of scale of organisation. We start looking at how it's going to impact on genes, on individuals and populations and communities. But there's also all these other processes that happen within biodiversity to ultimately allow these things to exist. So at the genetic level, how different species, their populations interact and exchange genes and disperse. Again, physiologically, how they adapt to change, that changes in heat, changes in precipitation, their morphology, how they look, their shape, their physical shape. Again, clearly distribution would be one of the classic ones. Where do we now find these species given this new climate regime, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole variety of different processes there that climate change is also impacting. So again, when we start looking at the individual level, internally, particularly at a cellular level or genetic level, there is now evidence accumulating there, but isn't as strong as when you start scaling up towards the species level for these different processes. Again, this particular review by Brett Schaefer's, the infographics were fantastic. So I'll let them tell a picture, and given time, I won't be able to give an example of everything. But just to give you a flavour, I mean, at the genetic level, we're expecting increasing rates of hybridization because of species that weren't really interacting so frequently. Now with the new regimes, they're starting to mix and intermingle far more than they used to be. So populations that used to be separated are now starting to come back together and hybridize. At a physiological level, there's also going to be that direct mortality due to heat stress. I mean, very unfortunately illustrated this year in Australia with mass die-offs of fruit bats and cockatoos. At a morphological level, I have a little example, I hope. So again, Irish example, not only has been measured already in dragonflies that they're all starting to get a little bit smaller, they're also now, again, this driver of natural selection. Climate change is now selecting for species that are lighter in colour across Europe. So again, this is an extensive database of dragonflies. Again, many of this collected by citizen science. And wherever you see red on that map of Europe, those communities, again, since 1988, I mean, quite recently, have now shifted their species compositions to having more species like this one, the black-tailed skimmer, common and widespread in Ireland. So wherever you see red there, those communities have now shifted to more warm-loving species. Again, in terms of population dynamics, another nice little example, again directly from Ireland, is a little fish, actually not so little, I think it's around a foot and a half, is the snake pipefish. So this particular species is a close relative of seahorses. And when we talk about these magnitudes of change, and we hear, okay, a 0.5 degree change, a 1 degree change, a 2 degree change, it's very difficult to assess that level of magnitude with a change within biodiversity. But this one was very clear in the sense that a half degree difference over a 50-year period has effectively changed the sex ratio in this species because it's operational sex ratio, because it's dependent on water temperature. So we get a very clear indicator of how physiologically species are now being impacted by climate change. We know this, but the evidence is now coming increasingly clear. Sorry. And again, with the others, just with time, I won't go through them. So I've spent some time, hopefully around 9 months, assessing exactly what has been the impact of climate change on, from our genes to organisms, up to communities and ecosystems, and then across a range of biological processes. So you'd leave here going, oh my God, it is now the key driver. It is very much important. And again, one of my own beloved little groups of insects that I like studying, and pollinators, is a lovely example of when we start looking at pollinator populations, how we can visualize all the variety of different drivers that impact on those populations. So particularly when we start looking about where these pollinators like living at regional scales, so across Ireland, across Britain. Again, this is where we start seeing very clear pictures of the signal of climate change impacting where species now live. But that signal isn't acting on its own. It's acting in concert with habitat loss and fragmentation, exactly as John introduced. As we start moving down towards maybe at the population level, or at the hive level, or the colony level, or the individual level, that's where the signal of climate change gets a little bit lost. It's not so clear exactly what is happening at that particular level of the species, because there other factors come into play. Again, nutritional quality of forage, as in less diversity of flowers, a less diversity of nutrition for the species feeding on them. That's where pests start coming into play. That's where pathogens start impacting on the individuals. And as you go down towards the genetic level, yes, climate change at a very broad level could be impacting, but we can't detect it at that level, really. There, the overriding factors, predictors of change, will be pathogens, and in this case, insecticides. So this isn't a strict ranking of impact. It's more just an illustration that depending on what level of organization you start studying biodiversity, the driver is going to be different. Yes, overarching climate change is there, but its signal may not be very clear, and it's not acting alone. It's interacting with all these other drivers of change too. So when we start looking at the relative importance of climate change in terms of biodiversity loss, this is a biodiversity conference. So when we start looking at the driver, climate change as a driver and its relative importance, again, it's a little bit dated now, but I still think that it's a very effective way of communicating the variety of ways that biodiversity is currently being lost and what's causing it. You'll see from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that would have clearly been done at the Millennium and published in 2005, that climate change, there's not many red squares there, the red being indicators of high impact. Again, for those systems that we're very aware of that are very vulnerable to climate change, like polar systems, upland systems, coastal systems, and also deserts and tropical grasslands. Their climate change is having an impact. But that is as of the year 2000. I'd be very curious to see this graph in 2050 and again in 2100. I can completely believe that the climate change itself, unfortunately, is accelerating, and its relative importance is going to also accelerate. So when we look right now about, okay, what is driving biodiversity loss in 2018? Well, we can look at something like the Living Planet Index. So this index of largely vertebrate populations across the globe, married with this very detailed database of all the pressures that are driving changes in those vertebrate populations. If we also put side by side the same story ultimately from the insect world. We can see that over 41% of insect species are now in decline, and compared to the 22% of vertebrate species. But what's causing these declines? And again, it's habitat loss, habitat degradation, habitat fragmentation. That's broad terms for ultimately we're losing their habitats, or their habitats are getting worse. So we must always remember that climate change is going to become an increasingly important driver of species loss. But definitely right now, it's habitat loss. And we shouldn't really conflate the two. Too often now people are seeing these broad-scale losses in common species and immediately going, oh sure, look, it must be climate change. And they're almost giving up, as in, well, climate change is very difficult to act against, so what can we do for that species? But they're completely ignoring that that species has lost vast amounts of its habitat within Ireland. And that's why it's in decline. Yes, climate change probably isn't helping, but the number one reason very much is habitat loss. So again, to always effectively communicate that in terms of extinction, the number one driver is still habitat loss. So data. So where are the sources of Irish, of biological data from Ireland that can support the tracking of the impact of climate change in Ireland? Well, I already mentioned it. One of the key ones would be our network of international phenological gardens. So within these gardens, there's specific clones of plants, and the various different population dynamics of those plants then are studied every single year. So like budburst in the downy birch example. The gold standard would also then be the long-term ecological research network. So it's a global network of sites where at any one site you start studying species composition, species abundance across a variety of different flora and fauna, and you also start studying physiochemical parameters relating to ecosystem services. But you're studying them all in the one location, and then multiple locations across Ireland, and then for long periods of time. So that spatially coincident data is absolutely key to provide to our modelers. They need those data rather than just trying to marry data that they currently have, the very detailed climatological data, with some data that we collected for another reason. The gold standard would be to collect those data together in the same locations in a standardized and harmonized way that we can also then share across Europe and also the globe. But one of the largest and most consistent and systematic data sets that we currently have is from citizen science. So citizen science is the involvement of volunteers in research, and it can be it's a genuine research approach that also engages people with climate science, with conservation science. And you can generate large amounts of data over large spatial scales and long periods of time. But again, the key component there is the genuine engagement with people in the process. So like that, this is part of my role within the data center. We currently have this wonderful group of people who go out across now almost 300 sites across the island of Ireland, walking a fixed route over a fixed time, recording all the, in this case, bumblebees and butterflies within a fixed distance as they walk along. So we have very good quantitative information about what our populations look like, how those populations change across the year, and then how those populations change across years. And it's these data then that we can start providing to start looking at sort of essential biodiversity variables for climate change in Ireland. And it's from these data then that we can start tracking the declines in these groups. But we can only start disentangling those signals of climate change and habitat loss and pollution and all the other drivers that push these species down the road towards the path of extinction when we have data of this nature. Okay, so to wrap up, look, I just hope I've illustrated that we should continue to invest and support in citizen science, both as a genuine tool for engagement with conservation science and climate science, but also as a very effective way of collecting exactly the type of data that Ireland needs to collect these essential biodiversity variables for Irish climate change. Thank you.
Have a seat there. Great, folks. We're tight on time now, but the consequence of the Slido is that we do have a single question that I will put to the panel there. What is the panel's view on the governmental strategy to offset emissions via state-aided forestry schemes at the expense of vulnerable habitats and species? Tomas, do you want to address that?
As long as it's done intelligently.
Good
I
answer.
think, yeah.
John.
Sorry, it's really beyond my remit, that one. Yeah.
Emission control. Paul, do you think that's going to make a big difference at reducing emissions here in Ireland through
I'm not too
forestry?
sure about reducing emissions, but the models do show increased forestry do cause a cooling effect, so it might have some mitigation effects on climate.
So Yvonne Buckley has asked a popular question there again. What actions do we need to take now to protect habitats and species vulnerable to climate change in the next 50 to 100 years? Tomas.
Well, not even the next 50 to 100 years. I mean, even within the next 20 years, if we have an overarching policy to protect nature in Ireland, and it's called the National Biodiversity Action Plan. And if the political will was there and the public will was there to make sure that a plan like that was fully financed, we would go a very long way to actually protecting biodiversity within Ireland. But it requires support of the plan. We already know how to reverse declines in species and habitat loss. We know how to do it. We just need to have effectively the finances and the public willingness to support us to do that.
Claire, can I get you to put the poll up? Does the poll reveal anything interesting from the room? Value. Right, there's a lot of bits of info there that people have put forward. Can I also ask now I have two other slides that I put down earlier. In discussions with some of the speakers here, we discussed the merits of putting forward some sort of proposal from this room, from what we had heard from the speakers, the idea of recognising some of the more significant things. And I'm going to ask the room really to give a show of hands about two little slides. So firstly, have a read of that one. This is to look at the importance that Tomas was underlying, the citizen science, recording butterflies and bumblebees. Now, some people might think, well, that's very nice, it's interesting information. It is fascinating what it has revealed that, like Tomas says, this habitat degradation is probably one of the most significant effects. And what we require here in Ireland is quantitative data in order to produce the stories that we need to convince the general public and politicians of the urgency of this work. It's very easy for us to frighten people with negative stories about the appalling loss of habitats and species. The important thing is having that information means that there should only be one answer that government will act upon. Can we just have a look at the next slide, please? And again, this is looking at the importance of modelling climate change, and that we ought to be ensuring that there is a long-term support so that people like Paul can actually collaborate with people like John Coll's team in order to use biological data to back up some of this modelling. Could we go back to that first slide? Would people be happy in this room that I literally deliver a bit of paper to the conference organisers proposing that we would like in the plenary that these sentiments, that the National Biodiversity Data Centre as a repository of both qualitative and now quantitative data is absolutely vital for us to be able to handle biodiversity loss in this country, and also that we need to support climate projection work and ecosystem service changes so that we can essentially ensure that there's a network of long-term ecologically monitored sites, some of the work that Tomas has been interested in. How do people feel in this room? Can I have you put your hands up if you feel this would be a valuable thing to put forwards? Well, that's good. Anybody have a point that they would like to say perhaps there is another thing? Now, there's a lot of other parallel sessions going on, so it is up to others to put forward some of these ideas. So, of course, we're not putting everything forwards. Does anyone have a reservation that they'd like to voice maybe to that? Well, that's good. Can we look at the next slide? Oh, sorry, we have one. Can you wait and announce yourself once you've got the microphone? Thank you.
Thanks very much. My name is Pat. Just not a reservation, but I think the support and is really good, but I think it needs a long-term, stable funding stream to deliver the objectives above. So I think it's missing the word long-term, stable funding stream to support both of those ambitions. I think would really strengthen the statement from this room.
Thank you very much. We shall add that wording. I think it is, very significant that the Biodiversity Data Centre really struggles on in the sense that it's got a limited budget and it has suffered severe cuts of late. And this is something that we need to recognise the value of this to developing the positive stories. One of the points that Ella McSweeney was making in the plenary is that we need stories, not facts. We need stories that have got a positive outcome. John.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, from our perspective of the work that we did, basically, the country, we had the financial crisis. The EPA funding was put there 2009 to 2012. So original research doesn't take place in a bubble. So the extensions in that work really just came from the goodwill of people once they were away from the core funding. So we'd built a certain capacity in terms of the spatial data. There's so much more could be done if we had stable funding to join up landscape data, climate data, biological data, then we could really look at this whole issue holistically. But it needs funding.
Thank you. Can we have a quick look at the second slide there? And then we'll come to, could we have the microphone down here, please? This was the second proposal that we would put forward, that essentially the work of modelling these things, the high-end computing that is needed, we need to collaborate from the biological world in order to have increasingly more accurate and valuable information. How do people feel about that being put forward to the final plenary? Can I have a show of hands of those who would be happy with that idea? A certain amount less, I feel, but we have a question from the floor there.
Thanks, Matthew, and thanks to all the speakers. I think it's very inspiring, the information that was put across. Tygo Mahoney, EPA, just reiterating the point about the funding. The concern I had was, and John, thank you for your presentation. You made the comment, we tried to keep the work going, and we really have to be looking at maintaining our research teams and looking at it, as was said there, long term. Because we've had ag biota, we have biosys, biochange, symbiosis. We've put together massive expertise. And if we don't have projects coming on stream to keep on board the teams, I think it's a waste of resources. So going forward, we have to go down that route. In relation to this particular point, many of our universities went away from classical botany and zoology, and particularly botany. I don't know how many courses treat or teach moss identification, fern identification, algae, seaweeds, flowering plants, as they did in the 70s, 60s, 70s, when biotechnology came in and wiped away many of the courses. And I think we should reinstate classical identification so that we get out experts who can actually start monitoring scientifically and providing the evidence moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I will add that as a fourth sort of bullet point to our proposal. So thank you very much. Right, you've got 5 seconds to get to the other things. So can I just quickly mention that there's an exhibition area under the Castle Hall, halfway across the quad there, but literally the other sessions are about to begin. Thank you very much to all our speakers.